Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the North Carolina branch of the International Dyslexia Association third coffee chat. During this time, we hope that you find these informative, quick. We were going to be doing a deeper dive into structured literacy later on this month, but tonight you are going to hear from one of our very own, Sarah Gray Horn. And what is it that we mean by structured literacy? Sarah Gray received her bachelor's degree in education and her master's in special education from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She currently works at the Hill Learning Center in Durham, North Carolina. Since 1984, she's held a variety of roles there, including teacher, administrator, and trainer. She is currently a member of Hill's professional learning team, where she serves as a teacher, educator, mentor, and project manager. And tonight, she is leading us in just a little bit of structured literacy. So Sarah Gray, thank you so much for taking the time tonight.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. It's great to have you here. If you would, please make sure you're muted, and if you turn off your video, that would be lovely. We're going to ask you to put questions in the chat and hold them till the end, and then we'll answer any questions that you might have at the end. Thanks so much for that. Appreciate it. Okay, we also have a note-taking guide for you and a list of the resources that will be discussed in this webinar at the bit.ly link below. You should be able to access that at any point. And now I'm going to get you started, but don't be worried about this. This is a brief history of reading in the United States, starting with colonial times. So it's kind of education 101. Anyhow, reading started, believe it or not, with the colonists with the New England Primer. And at that time, the colonists used phonics to teach children to learn how to read. Phonics instruction continued from colonial times until the 1920s. And in the 1920s, William Gray, who you may remember as the author of the GORT, the Gray Oral Reading Test, urged a shift to instruction for reading in the sight, using the sight word method or whole language method, saying that phonics instruction was heartless drudgery. Some of you may have learned to read using William Gray's books, the Dick and Jane books, Sally Dick and Jane books. And in the 1950s, the sight word approach came under scrutiny because critics said that the Dick and Jane books made it harder for children to learn to read. So, in the same era, in 1957, a man named Rudolph Flesch, who some of you may know for the Flesch Kincaid reading, published a book called Why Johnny Can't Read. And this book demanded a return to phonics instruction. But because his book was rhetorical, it was a rhetorical argument and not evidence-based, it didn't gain a lot of traction. But in 1967, Jean Chall, who was a noted psychologist and literacy researcher at Harvard, reviewed the research from 1912 till 1965 and concluded that a code emphasis or a phonics method of teaching produced the best results for students learning to read. The National Reading Panel, which I'm sure you've all heard of, in 2000 reviewed over 100,000 studies and again concluded that the best approach for teaching reading was a code emphasis approach or a phonics approach, along with within the 5 pillars of reading. And the 5 pillars of reading, I'm sure you've heard of: phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. In 2014, the International Dyslexia Association coined and trademarked the term structured literacy to identify reading methods that encompass the 5 pillars of reading and focus on the content and principles of instructions. So that's the evolution of phonics in the United States, of instruction in the United States. So the IDA definition of structured literacy is noted here, and you'll notice some key things here, particularly where teachers carefully structure important literacy skills, concepts, and the sequence of instruction. Also noting that structured literacy is the most effective approach for students who experience unusual difficulty learning to read and spell printed words. So basically the term structured literacy evolved as a more recent term. It evolved from the term you heard previously known as multisensory structured language. And structured literacy stands in contrast to many popular approaches to reading instruction. These popular approaches often do not teach oral and written language skills in an explicit and systematic manner. And that's what structured literacy demands. So in a nutshell, these are the key things to note about structured literacy. First of all, it aligns with the science of reading. And I know that's a huge buzzword out there right now. Science of reading is big. If you haven't had a chance to listen to Emily Hanford's Hanford, H-A-N-F-O-R-D's podcast on the science of reading, please take some time to do that this summer. Emily Hanford is a journalist, but she is the one who has brought the science of reading to the forefront so that the public is aware of it. Anyhow, Emily Hanford's podcast, please listen. Structured literacy includes content and principles of effective reading and instruction. It emphasizes highly explicit and systematic teaching, and we'll go over what that means, and all the important components of literacy. It addresses all the foundational and higher level skills, including syntax and semantics and pragmatics and discourse. And once again, it's synonymous with multisensory structured language education and also structured language and literacy education. So just a quick synopsis. So what are the principles of structured literacy? These are key. The first basic principle of structured literacy, you'll hear this a lot, is that it is explicit. And by explicit, I mean that it's direct, unambiguous instruction with the goal of student understanding. Explicit teaching means that there is a high level of teacher-student interaction. It is direct. It is not a guessing or discovery approach. There's no guessing at all. The teacher explains concepts and provides numerous opportunities for practice. Research shows that struggling students gain far more from explicit teaching than they do from discovery learning. So the skills are not only directly taught, they are directly practiced using the I do, where the teacher guides, you do, where the student practices, we do method, where the student and teacher do it together. As Anita Archer, who is one of the foremost researchers in explicit instructions, stated, this is not drill and kill, and to her knowledge, she doesn't know of anyone who's ever died of practice. So it's all about practice and repetition over learning and the generalization of skills. All instruction needs to be interactive, and as she says, done at a perky pace or a brisk pace. It's also very engaging. It is not drill and kill. Systematic means that the skills and concepts are taught in a logical, hierarchical order from the easiest concepts to the most complex concepts. And the skills and concepts that are previously taught are consistently reinforced and practiced. They aren't taught and forgotten. You consistently go back and review them. Hands-on, multisensory, that's pretty self-explanatory. It means you're using the sensory modalities, sight, sound, touch, to enhance and to anchor learning. This includes techniques very familiar to Orton Gillingham practitioners, techniques like finger spelling, finger tapping of sounds and syllables, tracing letters in sand, on sandpaper, on craft mesh with shaving cream, however, gross motor movements, writing and subvocalizing letters, all great OG techniques. Diagnostic means the teacher is constantly monitoring student progress to ensure mastery of skills. Students don't move on to a new skill until the current skill is mastered. Those are the key principles of structured literacy instruction. And now, what are the components? Okay, these should look familiar to you. Key structured literacy components are phonological and phonemic awareness, sound symbol correspondence, phonics and decoding, syllable type instruction, orthography, morphology, semantics, syntax, pragmatics, and discourse. Each of these components is a coffee chat in itself, so I'm not going to be diving into these tonight, or we'd be up all night. So we'll be breaking these components down for you in future chats. And for those of you who are familiar with the National Reading Panel and the 5 pillars of reading, you'll notice that there are similarities between what the National Reading Panel, the 5 pillars, and these components. The distinction is that structured literacy more carefully and specifically defines the instruction. So that's where the key difference is, but there is definitely an overlap with the 5 pillars. So who benefits from structured literacy instruction? What's most important for people to know is that it's effective for all students. It can be used as core instruction. It's essential for students who are at risk, and especially for students with dyslexia, because structured literacy is especially well suited for students with dyslexia because it directly addresses the core weaknesses of dyslexic students. It addresses phonological awareness, decoding, and spelling. Structured literacy has been endorsed not only by IDA, who coined the term, but also by ILA, the International Literacy Association. The principal difference with structured literacy between a typical reader and a struggling reader is in the delivery of instruction. The students who are at risk or have dyslexia will require more intensive instruction and repetition, often for a longer period of time. So Stephen Dykstra is a noted psychologist, educational psychologist, and I think he sums up structured literacy and the need for structured literacy well with this quote. Every child struggling to read or at risk of struggling needs the same thing in nearly every case, regardless of the reason they struggle or what puts them at risk. They all need structured literacy. Some will need it briefly, some for many years, but they all need it. And I hope that's your takeaway from this evening, because he says it best. Now, I hope I've whet your appetite to learn more about structured literacy if you weren't already aware of it. And so I've got a list of resources here, and these are available on the bit.ly that I'd love for you to explore when you have time this summer. The first is from our own Nancy Hennessy, who's NCIDA board member and the former president of IDA and a noted speaker. She does an overview of structured literacy on the Middle Tennessee State University dyslexia website. She does an expert minute. It's actually an expert under 10 minutes, but it's a great overview of structured literacy, and take a few minutes to watch that this summer. Another MTSU expert minute is from Anita Archer, and she delves into more detail about explicit instruction. I just kind of gave you a quick summary, but she goes into it with a little more depth. Her website, she also has explicitinstruction.org if you're interested in that. 2 readings, and there are many readings out there on the science of reading and on structured literacy, but these are 2 just to get you started. Suzanne Carricker, who used to be with the Nyhouse Education Center in outside of Houston, has written a white paper for Lexia Learning called Structured Literacy, Applying the Science of Reading in the Classroom. That is well worth your time. And Louise Spear-Swerling, professor in Connecticut, noted researcher, reading researcher and speaker, has written an outstanding article looking at structured literacy and how structured literacy compares with other typical literacy practices. And you can access that on the Reading Rockets website. And that's another website. If you're not familiar with that website, that's a great one to research in your spare time, if you have any. Also, our parent, the International Dyslexia Association, has designed a great infographic of structural literacy. If you're a visual learner like I am, this one's great for you to look at because it gives you a great overview of structural literacy in a very detailed graphic. The International Dyslexia Association also has a structured literacy brief that's about 10 pages that goes over what structured literacy is and how it should be incorporated into the school systems. So, as Prior said, this was a brief introduction to a very complex topic, but here's some other resources for you. IDA's website there, our website. We're going to start unpacking the components of structured literacy, starting again on July 21st at 1 o'clock and 7 o'clock, and you'll have the privilege of hearing Nancy Kaufman from the Shelton School in Dallas, who we are very fortunate to have had moved to North Carolina, and Nancy will be helping you to unpack that then. But now we're all here to help with any questions that you might have, or any ways that we can direct you to more information. So Lynn or Prior or Deb, do we have?
I got you, Sarah. I have a question here.
Okay.
How do I ask my student's teacher in school whether they use structured literacy?
Lynn, do you want to handle that one, or do you want me to give a suggestion?
Well, I think what I would do, rather than just ask a teacher, do you teach structured literacy? Because structured literacy isn't a program, it's a method, or not even a method. It really kind of helps us understand what we need to teach and how we need to teach. So what I would suggest you do is take the resource, and if you can flip back, Sarah, to the slide where you had Louise Spears-Swirling's article.
There you go.
Yeah, that second article, and Sarah has put that information in the bit.ly folder. And within that article, there is a table that does a direct compare and contrast of the how we teach and what you would see in a structured literacy classroom versus what you would see in a typical classroom. And I would focus some of my questions around some of those points, like for example, how do you address teaching sight words in your classroom? How do you allocate your time between language comprehension, reading comprehension, and foundational skills? What do you do when a child encounters an unknown word? So I think rather than just doing this huge question about do you teach structured literacy, I would kind of focus my questioning around some of those, what we teach and how we teach. And I think that article's, the table within that article is a good place to start. There's also, and if I can find it real quick, I'll put it in the chat box, but there is a great document that DPI worked with the Exceptional Children's Assistance Center in developing about questions parents can ask if you think your child has dyslexia or has reading difficulty. I don't remember exactly, but I will find that and I'll put it in the chat, and I'll also add it to the folder that Sarah's put together so that you can find it there.
Awesome, thank you. I had one more question here, and you might have just answered it through that table, but a lot of times we hear my school uses that Fontes and Pinnell. How does structured literacy align with Fontes and Pinnell guided reading? And I'm sure that's in one of those articles. So.
The structured literacy and typical literacy practices from Spears-Swirling, that table that Lynn was just talking about will really give you a lot of great information on that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would also say that if you attend our next webinar, which is going to be on the components about what we teach, and then the following coffee chat that we'll do will be on how we teach, I think that will also help you.
Awesome. And then just one more, just comment from Sharon Hopper. Thank you. Great job, Sarah Gray and NCIDA. Thanks for leading the learning.
Thank you, Sharon. Anything else?
Not that I see.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We enjoyed, thank you for your time, and we'll look forward to seeing you again on July 21st, I hope.
Thanks.
Thank you,
all.
Sarah.
Thank you,
you.
Lynn. Thank you, Deb. Thanks, Prior.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.